The ships arrived in January 1823. 240 people, families, farmers, doctors, a school teacher who had sold her house in Edinburgh. They had crossed the Atlantic for 7 weeks on the strength of a single promise, that what waited for them on the other side was a civilization, a capital city, paved streets, a cathedral, land already surveyed, already named, already theirs. What they found was jungle. Not undeveloped jungle, not frontier jungle with some rough infrastructure waiting to be finished. Empty, silent, the kind of silence that tells you no human being has been here in a long time. The colony of Poyais did not exist. It had never existed. And the man who built it, entirely out of paper, was already back in London, raising a second round. His name was Gregor MacGregor, and before we go any further, you need to understand what that name meant in 1820. MacGregor was not a con artist who stumbled into respectability. He was a decorated veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, a brigadier general who had fought alongside Simón Bolívar in the liberation campaigns of South America. He had commanded real troops in real battles. He had bled for causes that newspapers called heroic. When Gregor MacGregor walked into a London drawing room, he did not need to sell himself. The room already knew who he was. This is the first thing to understand about what followed. The early 19th century was a specific kind of world. Britain had just emerged from decades of war. Capital was looking for somewhere to go. The newly independent nations of South America, Venezuela, Colombia, the territories still sorting themselves out after Spanish collapse, represented exactly the kind of frontier that ambitious money was searching for. Bonds were being issued, land was being sold, investment prospectuses for places that most London bankers had never seen or could not have found on a map without assistance. The infrastructure of credulity was already in place. MacGregor did not build the conditions for his scheme, he inherited them. And what he chose to do inside those conditions is something that has no precise historical parallel. He did not sell a bad investment. He did not exaggerate the returns on a real asset. He did not forge a single signature or alter a single document that existed. He created a country, complete with a name, a flag, a constitution, an official language guide, a bank, the Bank of Poyais, that issued its own currency, the Poyaisian dollar, which he had physically printed and distributed. He created the bureaucratic skeleton of a functioning sovereign state, and he used it to extract £180,000 from London's financial markets. In modern terms, somewhere between $20 and $30 million, from something that did not be.
Here is where most accounts of Gregor MacGregor go wrong. They describe what he did. They do not explain how he thought. The distinction matters, because if you read the history as a list of fraudulent acts, he printed fake currency, he forged land grants, he hired actors to pose as Poyaisian officials, you will walk away thinking he was a gifted liar, and you will miss entirely what made him something far more precise than that. MacGregor understood something about the architecture of belief that most people, even now, have not fully articulated. He understood that people do not verify claims, they verify signals. Think about how you actually come to believe something is real. You do not trace every fact to its source. You cannot. It is cognitively impossible to do so for everything you encounter. Instead, you look for markers, consistent details, institutional legitimacy, the presence of other credible people who also seem to believe. You look for the shape of a real thing, not the substance of it. MacGregor built the shape. He started with geography because geography is the hardest thing to question. He had actually been to the Mosquito Coast of Central America, what is now Honduras and Nicaragua, in 2020 as part of his legitimate military career. He had met with the local king of the Mosquito Nation, a man named George Frederick II, and he had genuinely obtained, a land grant of roughly 8 million acres. Stop here. This is the fulcrum. The land was real. The grant was real. The territory existed on maps. What MacGregor did was take this genuine foundation and build an entire fictional civilization on top of it. And the existence of the real foundation made the fictional superstructure nearly impossible to challenge. If someone asked, "Does this territory exist?" Yes. Is there a land grant? Yes. Has MacGregor been there? Yes. Are there records of his time in Central America? Yes. Every surface question had a real answer. The fraud was not in the answers, it was in what the questions never reached. The documents he produced were extraordinary in their specificity. This is the second architectural principle. Detail is the language of truth. A vague promise can be doubted. A specific one is paradoxically harder to question because the act of specificity implies research, implies knowledge, implies someone who has been there and counted things. MacGregor's promotional materials, his guidebook to Poyais, ghostwritten but presented as an independent account by a man named Thomas Strangeways, described the capital city of St. Joseph in precise, unhurried terms. The town hall, the cathedral that could seat 400, the inn at the corner of two named streets, the quality of the soil in different districts, the depth of the river at various points, the names of the birds. The names of the birds. No one invents that kind of detail unless they have been there. That is what the reader's brain concludes, automatically, without deliberate reasoning. The guidebook ran to 355 pages. It included a dictionary of the Poyaisan language. It was sold in London bookshops as a travel reference. The third architectural principle was institutional laundering. MacGregor did not ask people to trust him personally. He built organizations that vouched for him and then let those organizations do the work. The Bank of Poyais was the masterpiece of this strategy. When you physically hold currency, paper notes with official engravings, denominations, a central bank name printed in formal typeface, your brain processes that object as evidence of a functioning economic system. Currency is not a promise, it is an artifact. It has weight. You can put it in your pocket. And an artifact, unlike a claim, does not feel like something you need to evaluate. He also appointed a Poyaisan legation in London, an actual office staffed with actual people that handled inquiries, processed applications, issued official correspondence on headed paper. If you wrote to the legation of Poyais and received a formal reply on official stationery, you did not experience that as receiving communication from a fraud. You experienced it as receiving communication from a government. The fourth principle was social proof, deployed at the precise moment of maximum doubt. Most fraud relies on the fraudster to personally reassure the mark at critical junctures. This creates a vulnerability,
The mark is talking to the source of the deception, and at some level, the brain knows it. MacGregor removed himself from that loop. He created a community of believers and let that community convince each other. The early settlers, the first wave, were largely working-class Scots, farmers, tradespeople, people who had saved for years to buy land grants at the Poyais land office that MacGregor had opened in Edinburgh. When they gathered to share their excitement, they were not hearing about Poyais from MacGregor, they were hearing about it from each other, from neighbors who had also bought land, from people who had spoken to people who knew people who served with MacGregor in Venezuela. The social proof was distributed, self-reinforcing, and entirely outside MacGregor's direct control, which made it vastly more powerful than anything he could have said himself. He had designed a belief system that propagated itself. There is one more element to the architecture, and it is the most important one. MacGregor chose his marks not for their gullibility, but for their desire. This is the inversion that most people miss. We assume fraud succeeds because it targets people who are easily fooled. The historical record suggests something more uncomfortable. The investors who bought Poyais bonds were sophisticated London merchants and financiers. The settlers who booked passage were not naive peasants. They were people who had worked hard, saved carefully, and made a deliberate rational calculation that emigrating to an established colony represented a better future for their children than staying in post-war Scotland. They were not fooled because they were simple. They were fooled because they wanted something real, and Poyais, as MacGregor had constructed it, looked exactly like the thing they wanted. The desire did not make them credulous. The desire made them motivated to resolve ambiguous evidence in favor of believing. There is a difference, and that difference is the engine of the entire scheme.
The first ship departed from the port of Leith, Scotland, in September 1822. Her name was the Honduras Packet. She carried 70 passengers, settlers who had paid for land grants, purchased Poyais currency to use on arrival, packed their belongings, said goodbye to people they expected to see again only if those people also eventually made the voyage. She arrived at the Mosquito Coast in late November. What they found at the mouth of the Black River, where St. Joseph was supposed to be, was a cluster of derelict wooden structures from an old British colonial settlement, abandoned decades earlier. Some collapsed walls, a church with no roof, jungle pressing in from every side. There was no town, there was no inn, there was no cathedral. Here is the moment the history books move past too quickly. The settlers did not immediately conclude they had been deceived. Read that again. 240 people arrive at an empty jungle, and their first collective response is not fraud. It is something has gone wrong. They assumed there had been an administrative error, a miscommunication, that perhaps they had arrived at the wrong landing point. Several of them wrote letters back to the Poyaisian Legation in London, requesting clarification. They set up a basic camp in the ruins. They waited. This is the breaking point, but it is not the breaking point you expected. The plan did not break when reality arrived. It broke because reality arrived in a form that the settlers' minds could not immediately categorize as fraud. MacGregor had constructed the belief so thoroughly that even its material refutation took weeks to register. Some settlers began to die almost immediately. The Caribbean coast of Central America in winter is not hospitable to people from Edinburgh in 1822. There was no infrastructure, no clean water system, no food supply beyond what they had carried, no medical support, or rather, there was one doctor, Nathaniel Young, who worked until he too fell ill. Yellow fever arrived in January. By the time a passing ship, the Kennersley Castle, whose captain happened to stop at the coast, encountered the settlement in April 1823, approximately 180 of the original settlers had died from disease, from malnutrition, from exposure, from the compounding failures that follow when the infrastructure you counted on simply isn't there. The survivors were rescued and taken to Belize. A second ship had arrived with more settlers during this period. Some of them encountered the dying colony and managed to turn back. Some did not. The exact numbers are disputed by historians, but the broad shape is not. MacGregor's plan did not produce a failed colony. It produced a graveyard. And yet, and this is the detail that defines the breaking point, MacGregor himself did not flee. When the news began to reach London and Edinburgh in mid-1823, when the newspapers started printing accounts from survivors and from the captain of the rescue ship, MacGregor did not disappear. He did not immediately flee the country. He issued a statement. He expressed regret that certain organizational failures in the colonial administration had led to difficulties in the early settlement phase. He implied that corrective measures were being taken. He spoke of Poyais in the present tense as if it continued to exist, as if it required only better management. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Some people believed him. The scheme did not immediately collapse. There were investors who continued to hold Poyaisian bonds. There were people who wrote to the legation. There were publications that gave him room to respond. The resilience of a constructed belief in face of contrary evidence is not a failure of the audience's intelligence. It is a structural feature of how beliefs work when they have been built with sufficient institutional depth. MacGregor eventually relocated to France, where he attempted a second iteration of the same scheme. He opened a Poyaisian land office in Paris in 1825. He sold bonds again. He attracted new settlers. He was eventually arrested in France and charged with fraud. He was acquitted. He died in 1845 in Caracas, Venezuela, having been granted a pension by the Venezuelan government for his legitimate military service decades earlier. He died a general, a decorated one. The plan met reality in January 1823 at the Black River on the Mosquito Coast, and reality won, eventually. But the gap between the moment the plan failed and the moment the belief collapsed was wider than almost anyone would predict. That gap is the most important thing about this story.
Here is what has stayed with me about this case. MacGregor did not target people who had stopped thinking. He targeted people in the middle of making one of the most consequential decisions of their lives: where to build a future, how to secure something lasting for their children, and he gave them an answer that used every available signal of legitimacy. The settlers who sailed on the Honduras packet were not passive. They read, they researched, they spoke to people at the legation. They held the Poyaisian dollars in their hands and felt the paper. They consulted the guidebook with its named streets and its cathedral that held 400 people, and a dictionary of a language that did not exist. They did everything we are told to do, and they arrived at a jungle. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. We have built modern institutions, regulators, ratings agencies, auditors, due diligence firms, specifically to prevent this category of error. These institutions exist because individual verification is not sufficient. But those institutions are made of people. People who check surfaces. People who verify signals. What would Gregor MacGregor build today? Think about that.